Welcome to Untold, a podcast about Utah's boldest entrepreneurs and business leaders and their behind the scenes battles, breakthroughs, and what the heck were we thinking moments. These are the stories that you wish you'd heard sooner about the businesses you might not have known were right next door. With me today is one of those businesses. It's Jace Norton, founder and CEO of Maya Bridge Language Services. Thanks for being here, Jace.
Hey John, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I got on your website and was looking around, learning a little bit about your business, and had a bit of a flashback. I spent my family and I have spent 3 years in Europe, and as an American, when I arrived in Europe, I looked at the map and figured, okay, here's Italy. Everyone in Italy speaks Italian. There's Germany. Everybody in Germany speaks German. But I
Right.
was shocked to realize that Germans on the German national news, when somebody from Bavaria in the south of Germany is speaking, they put subtitles on it because the people in northern Germany can't understand them. The
Yeah.
people in Switzerland, where I was living, that speak German, only about 30% of that German is decipherable or understandable by people in Germany. So I have to profess and admit a similar level of ignorance about Central and South America. In my brain, there's a part of me that says south of the Rio Grande, everybody speaks Spanish except for Portuguese in Brazil.
Right.
So I'm sure that's wrong. Please paint me a more realistic picture of the languages in Central and South America.
Yeah, so I think you bring up a really good point, and that is that we base our sort of opinions and the way that we think about different things on our perception, right? And our perception is based on what the inputs we're receiving. So like you said, we see in Germany, right? We've associated Germany with German, and we've associated South America, Central America with Spanish, right? And that's because that's what our perception has been. Everyone I've ever met from South America speaks Spanish, and therefore my perception is that everybody in Central South America speaks Spanish. But the reality, and this is true, just like you mentioned, it's true everywhere, not just in Central South America. It's true in Europe, it's true in the United States, it's true in Canada, in pretty much every place in the world. There are 7,000, over 7,000 languages still spoken today, and most of us are really only aware of maybe, a handful comparatively of those languages. So the reality is that there are millions, hundreds of millions of speakers of indigenous languages. Like I said, there's over 7,000 languages still spoken in the world, and I think it's somewhere around 3 to 4,000 of those are considered to be indigenous languages that are dying, basically. Uh, and so what happens is you have all these individuals, especially from Latin America, where there's still really strong, vibrant populations of indigenous communities who speak an indigenous language, and then they have maybe limited proficiency in Spanish. So it's kind of a spectrum, right? Some people are bilingual and they speak their indigenous language and they speak Spanish fluently. Some people are monolingual, which means that they only speak their indigenous language and they have very limited proficiency in Spanish. And like I said, that happens even here in the United States. Even here in Utah, we have a lot of indigenous people here in Utah, from the Navajo community to the Hopi community. We have people who still speak their indigenous languages. Granted, these languages are unfortunately dying. After each generation goes on, they're they're becoming less and less spoken, uh, a variety of factors. But the reality is that yes, just because someone is from a country where this is the dominant language does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that everybody in that country speaks that language.
Yeah, oh, great point. And amazing figures, 7,000 languages spoken today. Yeah, that's incredible. So Is it correct to think that you mentioned some of them are dying, that
Yeah.
that as generations move, that there's a kind of a movement toward the mono language or like the dominant language, and that maybe the grandfather or grandmother speaks, it's Spanish might be a second language, but for the grandchildren, maybe Spanish or even English, is maybe what they speak more often, and they speak the indigenous language with their grandparents.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a massive trend for a number of reasons. It's really unfortunate, but I hear stories of a lot of speakers of indigenous languages who essentially refuse to teach their children or their grandchildren their indigenous language because they have been so severely oppressed. They've received such intense discrimination, marginalization, exploitation, lots of things that indigenous communities around the world routinely and historically have faced.
Mm.
And because of those reasons, they are really hesitant to even want to teach future generations these languages. And so they specifically will say, no, no, like don't learn. Why would you learn that language? It won't do you any good. You need to learn English, you need to learn Spanish, right? So there's a huge de-emphasis that's unfortunately happening with a lot of families and individuals where they have been sort of brainwashed into saying your language and your culture are not valuable,
Mm.
right? You can't get a job if you speak your indigenous language. You will be discriminated against, you'll be oppressed, you won't get ahead in life. So forget that language and learn these global sort of dominant languages that will help you get a job. And
Mm.
my personal opinion is that yes, absolutely, they should be learning dominant global languages like English, Spanish, or whatever the language may be, but not at the expense of losing their indigenous language, right? Because there's so
Mm.
much that is lost when they lose that indigenous language. I believe that each language really represents a unique and distinct worldview, right? The way that you speak in your language really shapes the way you think about the world. And a lot of people are finding that indigenous communities and cultures have a lot of knowledge that's intrinsically enshrined in the language.
Mm.
And if you lose that language, you lose that knowledge, and it may never be able to be recovered. And we don't know what all of the different gems of knowledge and wisdom that we are missing out on if we let these languages die.
Yeah, I remember a saying, I don't know where it came from, but it was like the language is a window to the soul. And I don't know another language fluently. I know a little bit of some other ones, but it does seem that sometimes with language you can get a sense of that worldview from the way the language is put together. Do
Absolutely.
you have a favorite example of maybe something you've learned about a culture based on learning the language?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a big language nerd. I consider myself sort of I guess, an amateur linguist. So I lived in Guatemala for 2 years as a missionary for my church, for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I was assigned to learn Spanish. And then as soon as I got there, I was also assigned to learn the Kekchi language. So Kekchi is a Mayan language from Guatemala. And the Kekchi language is like many indigenous languages, it's really just beautiful. It's very metaphoric and has more to do with sort of parts of the body and the earth and things like that. So there's like all kinds of phrases in the Kekchi language that are just beautiful and really kind of give you a new perspective on the way that you think about different things. So the simplest example is just to ask somebody, "How are you?" in Kekchi, you would say "Masasalachol," which means, "Is there happiness basically in your heart?" And I think that that's just like a sweet and cool way to think about when we're asking people, "How are you?" You're asking, "How's your heart?" Like, "How are you?" how's your feeling in your heart? Are you happy? Are you sad? Is it painful or good? So that is something that's really cool. The other thing that I really like, there's in Kekchi when you say I understand something, um, the literal translation is I find its face. Like I find the face of this. So there's, I mean, tons of examples that are just like that, with the Kekchi language and with lots of indigenous languages where, we kind of have lost in like English, for example, we've kind of lost touch with like the emotion behind a lot of our language, I feel like.
Yeah.
And with indigenous languages like Kekchi, it's really still very actively present
Mm.
where you can see sort of the spirit of it, right? The talking about your heart and your spirit and the parts of your body. It's just it's a really cool language for sure.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm kind of chuckling because I'm remembering, when I was in Europe dealing with a lot of people where English was their second language. It exposed for me a lot of English things that where we say something but we mean something very different. Like
Yeah.
the example you used, like how are you or how's it going?
Yeah.
Right? We don't actually want an answer to that. Like that's just a basic greeting. And I remember asking someone from Czechoslovakia that, and 25 minutes later, after I'd heard about in detail everything that had led up to her feeling very frustrated at the moment and me going, what the hell just happened? Like, how do I get out of this? Like, then I realized that, oh, there are all sorts of things in English that I say that the literal meaning of it is, I mean something very different.
Yeah.
And yeah, I have a ton of examples of miscommunication from those times. So that I love those examples, though. Happiness in your heart. I'd like to kind of switch a little bit to the business side of this.
Yeah.
So so there are people, as you identify, there are people in South America who have various levels of proficiency in the dominant language. What is the impact for people who, day to day that primarily speak an indigenous language, but they're operating in a world that's speaking Spanish, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, it's really something that it's hard for us. We're as English speakers, we're pretty arrogant, right? We're used to everybody learning our language. We're used to everybody kind of coming to the table speaking our language. And as Americans, unfortunately, there's not as many of us as in other places of the world where, we don't learn as many other languages, right?
Hmm.
We're very used to everything's available to us in our language. We very rarely are faced with inaccessibility, right?
Yeah,
Unless we're living abroad, and those kind of relatively few of us that have lived abroad, you understand when you can't speak the language, it can be pretty difficult. Even then, we as speakers of English have tons of advantages. Like we can pull out our phones, and there's probably a bunch of different apps for most languages that can help us, right?
hmm,
Uh, we're also, many of us that speak English are pretty lucky to have had an education, so we can read and write in our language, right? Which
yeah,
means that I can pull out a translation app, and I might not be able to speak, this language with somebody else, but I can pull out a translation app. They can type something in, I can type things in. We can use different tools to communicate. When you talk about indigenous languages and speakers of indigenous languages, they do not have these advantages, right? Um, there is there's nobody else that is going to understand their language. It's not, unless they're from that same community. It's not like it's very, very rare, right? I being one of the weird exceptions, where if somebody speaks Kekchi, I happen to speak it and I can help them out, right?
right,
Um, but they don't have access to any kind of tools that can help them really. And so
right,
the impact would be in their home countries, you know, most countries, in Latin America do not really have an emphasis on accessibility for speakers of other languages. In the United States, we do have a lot more strong of a focus on accessibility because of different federal mandates, executive orders, and laws that we have here in this country that mandate, especially in um, sort of, I guess, what you could consider critical services,
Mm.
institutions that are providing critical and necessary services. So, like hospitals, schools, government institutions, basically anybody that's receiving federal funds. The law, according to what's called Title VI, essentially says that we have to provide meaningful language access to those people because if we don't provide language access to those people, it's considered, discrimination based on their national origin. Language is
Okay.
wrapped up in that. So in the States, we do have, more. We're still lacking in a lot of areas, especially when it comes to indigenous languages. We still have a long way to go, but we do at least say we're gonna make some effort. In home countries, and especially in Latin America, um, the the sense that I have gotten in my travels and my experiences and speaking with other people is that they do not have that kind of focus. And so, it's kind of a similar case. Even here in the United States, for example, we have tons of there's over 270 Native American languages that are spoken here in the United States. And we have not provided meaningful language access to those individuals. And in fact, historically, we have, as a country, we have systematically basically eliminated those languages
Mm.
forcefully, right? There
Yeah.
were laws in the United States that said you're not allowed to speak in your indigenous language. There was these horrible, atrocious policies of basically kidnapping kids and putting them
Yeah.
in boarding schools and saying you're not allowed to speak your language anymore. You're going to basically become quote unquote an American, and you're going to learn English. And so they essentially have intentionally eradicated, right? Sort of this ethnic
Hmm.
cleansing, this cultural cleansing, um, coercion into, this forced assimilation, basically. And that is unfortunately the precedent in many, many, many places around the world. And I think Latin America is, again, a big part of that. So you've had all kinds of discrimination against people who speak indigenous languages, marginalization, and just kind of horrible things that have happened. And so the result of that is after centuries of that happening, there's a mixture of people not really even being aware. I've met tons of people from different countries who have said, "Wow, I really had no idea." Just like here in the United States, if you're really confronted with like all of the different languages here, most people would say, "Wow, I had no idea. I assumed that everyone spoke English by now or that, those languages are long gone." And the reality is that there's so much more that you can learn even about your own country, the demographics of your own country. And so that mixture of the ignorance of really having no idea, and then the other piece being those that do have an idea also have these misconceptions of, well,
Mm.
they all speak Spanish anyways, right? Or at least
Right.
they will. If they don't already, they will at some point. So why are we going to spend time, creating meaningful language access for them when in reality they just need to learn Spanish, right? That's kind of the attitude
Okay.
that has been historically present.
Okay. So it's a little bit sounds similar to what happens in the U.S. So people who maybe, if they have to go to the hospital, they have to bring their daughter so that so that they can translate for
Yep.
the between the doctor and the grandmother or
Yep.
um, things like that. So my abridged language services. Tell me a little bit about the services that you offer. Like who's a typical client, or what kind of work do you do down there?
So yeah, so MyBridge works exclusively in the United States. Unfortunately, I
Okay,
wish that we had the demand from other clients in Central Latin America, but we don't. So the all of the work that we do is here in the United
here in the
States,
U.S. Okay.
and so it's really, I think, kind of shocking to people to learn, and it was to me even, right? And even I, having learned an indigenous language and lived in a community that's pretty substantial, right? There's over 1 million speakers of Kekchi in Guatemala and Belize. But even, being relatively exposed to that culture and that language and those people, I never would have expected that there would really be many of those people who live here in the United States.
Yeah, I sure didn't. Yeah, I looked at your website and I assumed that you were offering those services down there, right?
Yeah, and that's what you would
Yeah,
think, right? You would think, oh,
yeah.
okay, so that's where those people live in Central South America. And the answer is actually no. There's hundreds of thousands of speakers of these languages who have immigrated to the United States.
Wow.
And many of them are fleeing, internal violence,
Hmm.
exploitation, discrimination, all these factors that have plagued indigenous communities for so long. They're fleeing that and coming to the United States and trying to, seek asylum or just seek a better life. And so, and there's like specific events as well that in history that have kind of spurred a huge migration. In the 80s, the 60s to the 90s in Guatemala, there was a very violent genocidal campaign against indigenous people. Um, and it's now recognized by institutions like the Holocaust Museum, right? Recognized as a genocide that was carried out by the state government of Guatemala against indigenous peoples, where villages were destroyed, people were disappeared. There was all kinds of atrocious, rape, murder, and different things that happened, and so they kind of forced this migration of indigenous people specifically to Mexico and the United States. And because of that, you kind of set this like anchor point of now, okay, now there's people living in this state in the United States. And that in turn, as time went on, it kind of spurred increased motivation to migrate, right? These people started to see the sort of successes or, different opportunities that were available to these other people who kind of were making it out essentially.
Yeah.
And so, all across the United States, you have substantial, very, very large communities of speakers of indigenous languages. I would say that the majority are from Mexico and Guatemala,
Okay.
but there are also substantial communities from indigenous populations from South America as well. And so my how I started my bridge was that I was personally recruited to be an interpreter for Kekchi,
Okay.
specifically for immigration hearings. So I was contacted by a company that said, we have a need for Kekchi interpreters for immigration hearings. And at the time, I just thought, this would be a really fun way to keep up my language skills and maybe make a couple hundred extra bucks, twice a year. That's kind of what I went into it with. And it turned out that they were having me do 10 to 15 cases a week, all across the country. And so I was flying to New York City, and then I would fly to Miami, and then I'd fly to Houston, and then I'd fly to San Francisco.
Wow.
And so it was really just everywhere and very, very, substantial demand. And it really blew my mind because I never would have, guessed if you had asked me, hey, how many speakers of Kekchi do you think are in the United States? I would have said, I don't know, maybe a few hundred maximum, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Because when I was there living in Guatemala, I met people who would tell me, yeah, I've never left this region. I've never been outside of this region. And so again, based on my perception, right, you make all these assumptions. And so my my assumptions were all shattered, right? And so then it was like, okay, there's a lot of Kekchi speakers. But then it turns out that there's speakers of all of the languages from Guatemala, which there are 22 distinct Mayan languages from Guatemala, plus two other non-Mayan indigenous languages in Guatemala. And it turns out that there's really substantial communities of almost all of these languages here in the United States. And so I started, as I worked as an interpreter, I could see tons of demand. And I could also see that the sort of players in the language services industry, they just didn't have the awareness, the expertise, and the sort of experience that was needed to handle the demand for these languages in any kind of way. There was some level of success, right? But it was very limited in scope. And essentially, what I was seeing is that in the language services industry, the most mainstream, most in demand, most commonly requested languages get all the attention, right? And they basically take up all of the time and energy and efforts. of these large players in the industry. And indigenous languages that are less commonly requested, harder to source, they essentially kind of become an afterthought where it's like, oh, we want to be able to do this language because we want to keep our client happy, but also we're not that concerned about it because we only get a request for this language from this client once a month. And so
Okay.
that's really when I decided, something needs to be done, to really put more emphasis on lower diffusion, lower density or lower resource languages. And that's when I started Maya Bridge.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Um, so you found this niche, and because your worldview was kind of exploded. It was like, wow, there's a whole bunch of speakers of this language here. I'm curious, are there concentrations of them? Like I'm thinking of, like how you see like there's a large Islamic community in Detroit,
Yep.
or there's Bosnian community in St. Louis, right?
Yep.
Because of waves of immigration. Do you find areas of concentration of, for instance, Kekchi?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
It's exactly the same with other immigrant groups, right? Somebody starts there and then other people join them, and then pretty soon you have a really substantial community where they're concentrated. So, for example, Kingston, New York, is just full to the brim of speakers of Kekchi. I mean, just tons and tons. I went there last year just because I'd heard that there was a large community, and you could literally, I could walk around for just a few minutes and find somebody that spoke Kekchi there. Um,
Wow.
and that's just Kekchi. Then you have other languages like Mam. This is another language from Guatemala. Oakland, California, just full to the brim of speakers of Mam. So, 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 so many different speakers of Mam there. And same thing, I went to Oakland, California. This is back when I'd first started Maya Bridge, and we had our clients were saying we need Mam, right? So that was one of the first, like we were providing mostly Kekchi, and then our client said, "Hey, we need mom." And so, I did some research. I found that mom was really prevalent in Oakland, so I flew to Oakland,
Hmm.
and the work that we initially did, and really the work that we still do, most of the work that we do is relating to government contract work. So I would say that the major sort of the majority of the work that we're doing is for unaccompanied children. So we get a lot of kids between the ages of basically 2 to 17, and they come here without their legal parent or guardian, and they have to go through an interview process, right? And so we provide interpretation for all the interviews that they have to go through to make sure that they're going to be safe. There's no risk of human trafficking, things like that. And unfortunately, they require us, they say any interpreter that provides services for that type of work has to be either a US citizen, US resident, have asylum, or have some kind of work authorization that allows them to work, right? You can't
Hmm.
use somebody that lives in Guatemala, for example. And so we were presented with this kind of issue of you need to find us interpreters of the Mam language and other languages that have the ability to work in the United States legally. So I flew to Oakland, and I had flyers that I was putting up, and literally the first place that I stopped, I stopped, I parked. I remember I parked outside of a Goodwill, and I thought, I'm sure people. This is a high traffic area. Goodwill is like a good store, especially if you're looking to save money on clothes and things like that, right? I got out of my car and walked over to like a light post that I was going to post my flyer on, and I saw a man and his wife, and I could immediately tell that they were from Guatemala, just being very familiar with the region. And his wife was wearing the traditional Mayan, it's called corte, which is like colorful Mayan dress for women, right?
Yeah, yeah, I've
I
seen
knew
them.
that they
Yeah.
were from Guatemala, and I knew that they were likely Mayan, right? And so I went up to them and I spoke to them in Spanish, and I said, "Are you from Guatemala?" And they said, "Yes." I said, "Do you speak Mam?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Do you have authorization to work legally in the United States?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Are you looking for work?" And he said, "Yes." Right. And so, um, and we hired that individual, and he worked for us for like 2 years, basically, providing interpretation as a Mam to Spanish interpreter. So to answer your question, yes. I mean, communities like that all across the United States, all
Mm.
across the United States. And I've been out to Indiana, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, Washington State, Oregon, all of these places that I've been to that I mentioned. When I get on Google Maps, I can find these communities, and you find little things like this is the panaderia, which is like a bakery, right? Like a bakery that says like
Yeah,
bakery
yeah.
Tikal, right? Tikal is like the famous.
Hmm.
So I'm like, okay, I know that these people are Guatemalan, and so then I go and I find them, and yeah, and, lots of times they are owned by speakers of these indigenous languages, or they have people working there that speak indigenous languages. So it's
Yeah.
way more substantial than I think almost anybody realizes.
Now I'm sitting here wondering because I like a couple blocks away, we've got a pupuseria that there's probably people from Nicaragua that speak indigenous languages that
Yeah,
are
you get
working there. Oh,
Guatemala is really sort of unique because in countries like Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, the indigenous languages that were there have almost completely died. There's very, very,
oh,
very few of the indigenous languages in those countries. But Guatemala and Mexico, for whatever reason, I think a lot of it realistically has to do with geography. They're
mm,
more rural, more removed, more in Guatemala. They're
in the
in the
mountains.
and
Hmm.
so they've retained their culture and they've retained their language. But you never know because we do indigenous language access for languages like Miskito, which is from Honduras and Nicaragua. It's not
Mm.
as common, but with Guatemala, it's like, I mean, 50-50 basically that somebody
Wow.
could be indigenous. And even, there's a lot of people in Guatemala who identify as indigenous, but their language has maybe been lost a little bit.
Okay.
But I mean, with Guatemala, it's a lot more likely that if somebody is from Guatemala, they are going to either be indigenous maybe or know somebody or work closely with somebody who's indigenous. I was in Providence, Rhode Island, another area that is has a large population of speakers of a language called Quiche, which is different than Kekchi, but very closely related. And I went to one of these bakeries and I spoke to the owner and he didn't speak an indigenous language, but he said, "Hold on, I got somebody here." And he called to one of his employees in the back that was making bread and came out and I speak a few words in a lot of these Mayan languages just from my experiences. And so I spoke to him in his language and I said, "Hey, how are you?" And he was all shocked and surprised and so that kind of thing happens, all the time. All
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So as you're looking for people to work, I'm thinking about like in like in Europe, there are systems to assess fluency and things like Cepher and things like that. Like, I'm assuming that you don't have any of that. Like, do you have to just kind of assess based on kind of word of mouth, or how do you know when you've got the right person?
Yeah, so that is one of the biggest challenges in the sort of language access interpretation industry is, the first challenge is that people don't even know, they're not even aware that these languages exist. They have no idea where to find the resources. And then the second challenge would be that when they do find the resource, they're kind of just like taking it at their word that they speak this language. And I know that because as I was hired to be an interpreter, very, very, very few of the agencies that I worked for had me provide any kind of language proficiency testing. And the reason for that is, yeah, there's no one has developed anything for language proficiency testing in these languages.
Mm.
So you can't get like an ACTFL test, for example, in Kekchi or Sefer. These things don't exist in the
Yep.
Kekchi language. And sort of the way you could get around that is if you said, "Well, I got my high school diploma from a high school in which this is the language that's the predominant language," right? That's
Hmm.
also a problem because there's no like even a high school diploma from somewhere in Guatemala, they're teaching in Spanish, right?
Yep.
So so that's an issue that, I believe we need to fix, and that's something that we have done, right? So we kind of have just taken our own initiative to create language proficiency testing. For Kekchi, I can do it myself, and so I do like a two-way. I have them interpret from English to Kekchi and Kekchi to English by providing like a live simulative experience where I'm playing the role of, let's say, the social worker and the
Yeah.
Kekchi speaker, and then my potential interpreters will, interpret both ways.
Back and forth.
Yeah,
Yeah.
both ways.
Okay.
And
Interesting.
and then for languages aside from Kekchi, where we don't have as much, um, because I don't speak those languages, right? We just do a one-way sort of simulative experience, and we record their answers. And so there, we have them either do from English to the target language or Spanish to the target language. We provide, everything in either English or Spanish, and they interpret everything into their target language. And then we take
Good.
those recordings and we send them to one of our evaluators. We find and vet somebody that we can, basically vet as being an expert in the language. And then we send them the recordings, we send them what the script is supposed to say, and then we send them the candidates' recordings, and then they kind of give them a score basically.
Okay.
Um, and so, yeah, we're really, I think, really truthfully the only ones that do that.
You're almost designing the system as you go.
Yeah, I mean, it's just
Mm,
like I said, I want to raise the standard of the industry. I don't want to just say, oh, we're just happy we found someone that supposedly speaks it. We wouldn't do that for these mainstream languages because we would understand that just because somebody claims to be a native speaker even doesn't mean that they have the language proficiency necessary to interpret. And so, yeah, we've really tried to make that a point of change that
mm.
we're working to improve that across the industry.
Okay. Um, so you were working as an interpreter, kind of found this niche, this need, started a company. So what were some of the maybe misconceptions or mistakes like that you've learned from so far on your journey?
I think the biggest mistake or challenge that happened in the early stages of starting this company was that I kind of was working under the assumption that um, I would need to bring people in as sort of part owners who would be able to do some work, um, because I didn't really understand that, how to get funding to pay for employees as opposed to bringing in partners, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And my biggest mistake was that I brought in two close friends at the time to become co-founders of this company. And these were two individuals who also, similar to me, they had lived in Guatemala, had spoke as missionaries, had learned the language. But neither of them was working as an interpreter. We're not working in the industry. So I brought them in really without a clear um, need for, like, there was nothing that they provided that I needed.
Yeah.
But instead, what I did was I took my needs and tried to say, okay, this is what I need, and can you do this? Without them really having the background and expertise that the company truly needed. And so essentially it was, I was thinking, well, I don't have any money to hire somebody. So what I'll do is bring in these friends and they can serve in these functions. Um, and, and they'll just be kind of founders or owners of this company.
Hmm.
And so that was my first problem was that, I kind of threw this together. I brought in people that were not qualified to do a lot of the stuff that needed to be done and gave them, sort of sectors of responsibility. And then the second thing that was a problem was that in doing that, I also um, did not set us up for what might happen if we failed, if things didn't work out. I did not set that up well. We did not use like a lawyer or anything as we set up our operating agreement. We just kind of used something that one of these my friends at the time had produced as an operating agreement, and we made a few modifications. But
Hmm.
I went into it thinking, we'll work it out. I don't think there's ever going to be a circumstance in which I would, part ways with them or something because they're my good friends, right? So that was a huge incorrect assumption because as time went on, you know, our business model at the very beginning was very different. We were essentially only set up to be a subcontractor for this company, another language service company that had a large contract.
Okay.
Uh, so they had a large contract to provide services for this specific location, a specific emergency intake site for unaccompanied children. And we were essentially just acting as an appendage for them to provide, make sure that they had the support for these indigenous languages. We were only doing, maybe 6 to 10 different languages. We had maybe 60 contractors total. Um, and over 95% of our revenue came from this single source. Um, and so as time went on, I started to be very worried about that because I knew that this was not a sustainable business model. First
Hmm.
of all, because we were limiting ourselves, right? I wanted to do more. I wanted to do more languages. I wanted to reach out and get clients from all over directly and not have to work through some other language service company, but to be our own language service company. And so over the course of like 8 months, basically seeing kind of this trend or this potential massive critical failure that would come to us if we somehow lost this contract, I kind of set about to do a 180 with the company.
Yep.
And these two friends that I had brought on had been doing okay, right? It wasn't like they weren't doing their jobs at all, but they certainly, like I said, were not really, um, didn't have the experience that they would need to really function very well as sort of the operations manager,
Hmm.
and like sort of the financial and advertising and things like that. And so I kind of started to try and prompt and say, hey, look, the work you're doing has been acceptable in the sense of for this company to remain stagnant and not grow, it's been okay, right?
Hmm.
But right now we have to change that. We have to. I can't deal
Got to
with just
level up.
yeah,
Yep.
it can't just be okay. It can't be mediocre. It can't be unacceptable, right? Because there were many things that were happening that was like, well, it's not really like it. In my head, I was thinking, man, they're not doing a very good job. But then the excuse was, well, it doesn't. They don't really have to do a very good job because the client, our main client, does most of the heavy lifting, most of the work for us.
Hmm.
So the only reason they would really need to do a good job is if we want to grow. And so when I finally kind of made this realization that we have to grow, we can't just afford to be less than okay on this work that we're doing. That was when I tried to kind of pull them along and say, all right, I need you to really step up and we need to do these things and you need to do these things. We need to improve these. We can't have these kind of mistakes and errors because if we have these kind of mistakes and errors or just apathy about the work, um, we won't be able to grow. And so yeah, it resulted in me not being able to get them to get to the level that they needed to be in,
Okay.
and ultimately for the company, I had really no choice. There was really no choice but to part ways with them, especially when we
Yeah.
did lose that contract, that main source of revenue for us that
Oh
accounted
wow.
for 95% of
So
our revenue.
you'd have been dead in the water.
Well,
Yeah.
we lost that opportunity, and
Hmm.
it was like they were not able or willing to be what the company needed to grow, and to really be a full-fledged interpretation company, right? They were only able and willing to sort of get us to the point of just being contractors where the work was easy. They didn't really have to do very much.
Yeah.
Uh, and so when we got to this point where the company was like, we're dead in the water, we have essentially no revenue, then, that's when I finally had the courage and sort of the determination to say, all right, it's time for us to part ways. We can't continue to operate, obviously, because that model that you guys that were the only thing you were able and willing to kind of achieve is now not even viable anymore. And so I parted ways with them a couple of years ago, and obviously did not go well. There was a lot of misunderstanding. I definitely take responsibility for not handling it in probably the best way.
Hmm.
I tend to want to avoid confrontation and conflict. And so I
Then
think
it builds up. Right.
took an approach of kind of like rip the band-aid off and run. And so there are definitely things that I should have done better. But at the end of the
Hmm.
day, that was my decision. I was confident in that decision. I knew that for the sake of the company, as the CEO of the company and as the primary founding member, there was no other option. There was no other choice.
Yeah.
And so that was the most difficult hurdle in starting the company was going from working with two of my really good friends and we were making really good money to and part of the reason that we were making good money is that we were foolish and naive about we didn't retain profits and reinvest things and it was kind of we were just making it out
You
like
were
band.
just emptying the piggy bank all the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
so yeah, lots of things that were not sustainable.
Yeah.
And so getting over that hurdle of having to basically restart um, with and that's the point where I said, okay, I don't really have that much money, but I know that I need to hire somebody. And so
Yeah.
I hired a couple of people that were absolutely leagues better than what these two former partners, right, were doing,
Hmm.
because those other guys, they didn't think of themselves as, I need to work, right? They just kind of thought of themselves as like, yeah, like I own part of this company, and like they did some work, right? But it was both of them had other like full-time gigs. And so for them,
Yeah. Yeah.
very much a side hustle.
Side gig. Hmm.
And so bringing on people that actually had the qualifications that were from the language services industry, that had experience working in operations and language services and things like that, just was an absolute game changer.
Mm. Yeah,
And
that's a great example. That's one of those things that I've heard people call expensive lessons.
yes, very expensive lesson. And so, I wish that
Mm.
I had just had the foresight to say, well, let's figure out the finances to be able to hire someone who I know is going to do a good job, instead of giving out ownership to the company in exchange for services, essentially, right? I don't think that's ever a good idea, right? Especially where this isn't, it's not like the person you're bringing in is a friend and also not in from that industry. It's just a horrible idea. um that's been
Okay.
probably the biggest hurdle, was that.
Mm.
And so then since then, we've really crawled back, we've made it back, we've completely changed the way that we work. We're now a fully fledged interpretation agency where all of our clients, almost all of our clients are actually direct clients and not other language service companies. So most of the people we work with are actual hospitals or
Okay.
nonprofits, right? So yeah, I would say that's
Oh,
been probably
cool.
the biggest challenge company wide, was that. And now that we've kind of figured that out, we've gotten into a really good rhythm.
Good. So, I'm curious, if you looked ahead 5 years, if you're able to do everything you want to do, and where will Maya Bridge be in 5 years?
It's a good question. I think there's a lot that I would like to do, and I think one of my problems is I need to figure out what needs to be done in relation to what I would like to do. I'm really more of an ideas guy. I'm not. I'll be the first to tell you that I'm really not the most business-minded individual in terms of implementation of business plans and all these different things. I feel like I've sort of accidentally become the CEO of a company, right? Like I never intended, was never really of a super entrepreneurial spirit. It just kind of everything just kind of fell into my lap essentially. And so that's also been part of the struggle, is just kind of figuring out a business model. And again, we've been very fortunate in the sense of we have a very unique niche, and clients essentially just come to us. We don't have to do a lot of like getting other clients, right? They just come and
Hmm.
find us and we provide the services for them. So, ideally, I think in my 5 year sort of vision, what I would like to achieve is I'd like to figure out a way to generate um, substantial revenues that will allow us to keep doing the work that we really want to do, right? I don't necessarily intrinsically, I don't really have much of a huge desire to become a huge language service company that is providing all languages for a bunch of different clients, right?
Yeah.
Mostly
Okay.
because I know that there's tons of other people that already are doing that. But I recognize that without becoming that, I won't we won't grow enough to be able to
Mm.
continue expanding upon the services that we really are passionate about and care about, which is ensuring that speakers of indigenous languages get the same access. So, I think my 5 year vision would be to really step into those shoes and figure out ways to become, you know, a a main service provider for language services instead of a supplemental vendor, which is currently what we mostly exist as. Most of our clients utilize us as a supplemental vendor. They have their normal vendor for most of their language services, and then they reach out to us for what their normal vendors
Okay.
are able to provide. So I would like to do that because again, I think that it's a necessary part of our growth. If we want to keep doing what we're doing, we have to be able to offer these comprehensive services. The other area in which I would really like to expand is, you know, we are a for-profit company, but I always call us a not just for-profit company, meaning that we do want to make profits, and that's a key part of our business model. But the reason we want to make profits is not so that any of us can become super, super wealthy, but really so that we can use those profits to continue expanding our impact. And so, there's so many different projects that I want to work on um, to help beyond just language services for Indigenous communities. I want to go and get into the communities in the home countries and the home
Mm.
regions. People are still suffering, where there's lack of education, where there's a lack of resources, where languages are dying. I want to get into more language conservation efforts, community empowerment efforts, and all these different areas that I really want to get into so that we can really make even more of a difference, right? I feel like
Mm.
providing language access is great and it does absolutely make a difference and it's critical for people, especially, who are in court hearings or in prison for a crime they may or may not have committed, right? And they need to have interpretation to really express themselves clearly. It's absolutely critical, but I feel like it's really limited in the amount
Mm.
of sort of actual good that we can do as
Actual
well.
impact. Yeah.
Yeah, in many ways. And so I
Huh.
really like to get into that as well, right? And expand into
Yeah.
that and figure out again, I kind of am a believer that, nonprofits are essentially limited because they rely upon other people to fund their efforts, right? They need funding. And
Hmm.
so I'm a big believer in creating entities that pay for themselves. So we're looking into some other different types of avenues of creating other sources of revenue that can then continue to support other things that we'd like to do, other areas in which we'd like to make an impact. So,
Okay.
as an example, I really have a strong interest in increasing literacy for speakers of Indigenous languages, which will help just increase that literacy level for the community, but also will help in conservation efforts, conserving the language, making sure that stories don't die, that the language can be conserved and passed on to future generations. So we're looking at starting a publishing branch where we're going to try to publish things that are going to be viable from a revenue standpoint that will
Hmm.
sell
Hmm.
so that we can publish things that won't sell but will make a difference, right? Because
Yeah.
If I write a children's book in Kekchi, obviously that's not going to be an international bestseller. It's extremely niche and extremely, very small market.
Yeah.
So that book is not going to generate the income, but maybe we come up with other books that generate income, and then we have this revenue that we have the ability to play with, and then we can go and do good things like publish books in Kekchi, so that
Okay.
and establish literacy centers and communities in Guatemala, so that speakers can have similar resource access to resources, right? So
Yeah. No,
all of
that
the
was a really, you said a lot in that answer. Like,
yeah,
so there's, what I heard clearly, right, is that, you're there, this is a purpose-driven enterprise for you,
yep,
right? That, the profit is in order to fulfill or further the purpose, right?
absolutely.
Um, I'd love to hear again. One of the things that I saw your eyes kind of light up as you started talking about language and culture conservation. Um, Tell me more about why is that so meaningful to you? Tell me more about what's behind that.
So I think that language conservation and the conservation of culture is really, really, really important for a number of reasons. One of the big reasons being that each different language in the world represents a very unique, distinct worldview. Um, the way that we use our language, the way that we speak, really shapes the way that we think and the way that we view the world, the way that we approach problems, the way that we look at what's most important, right? And every time that we lose a language, we're losing that unique worldview. We're losing the potential to approach a problem from a way that nobody else is thinking, right? And like I said, I like to say that um, we may have the cure for cancer and might be enshrined in this knowledge of an indigenous culture and through their language. And maybe we just don't know about it, right? Maybe they have this cure for cancer, and if that language is lost, we just lost that knowledge, right?
Mm,
So I think that it's really important for that reason, but also from just a human rights and human dignity. I think it just is the right thing to do, right? The world is so much more beautiful because of the diversity in thought and the diversity in language. And we lose a little bit of that beauty every time a language dies or a culture dies. And I think that while it's important to be a bilingual citizen of the world, to be multilingual, to learn other languages, learn other viewpoints, expand our knowledge, expand our sort of understanding of the world, I think that that's important, but not at the expense of losing a key part of your identity, right? Um, I don't think that that's right, and I think
mhm,
that it just is morally something that we should be doing. And the problem is that nobody really cares. Nobody is as passionate. I mean, that's not true. There are plenty of people that are passionate about it, just like I am. In fact, way more passionate than I am, and are doing more work than I am. But what I'm saying is nobody from a funding standpoint,
mhm.
or relatively speaking, nobody, right? Even there are programs that exist and governments that are investing, right? Even here in the United States, there's sort of this 10-year Indigenous language revitalization plan that supposedly has money. The problem is that you need more than just money. You also have to have the framework and the network and the structure, all of these things that you have to have for it to really be successful.
Yeah.
And and relatively speaking, right, there are not that many people that are interested in it, especially not like
Mhm.
most of the people that are interested in it typically are like from those indigenous communities.
Right. Right.
So I think there needs to be a lot more of people like me who I'm not from the Kekchi community, but I'm very highly invested and I want to see that community and other indigenous communities succeed. We need more individuals to step up. And again, I also believe that we need to approach it from, if everything is a nonprofit, I have to rely on the government to pay me to be able to do this work. I think we have to find ways around that because I mean, especially in countries like Latin America, right? They're not
They
providing
don't
any
have
money.
money to, yeah, they're
If they do, they're not really interested in that, right?
yeah.
It's almost counter to their interest because every
Mm,
time they empower some marginalized community, that gives them power that may then detract from their own power that they're used to and comfortable
right.
with. So, I think a lot of it is finding how can we create industry that can fund a lot of this stuff. And I think that there's already frameworks out there that exist, right? Indigenous people are very often stewards of tons of natural resources, right?
Hmm.
All
Hmm.
across the world, right? There's indigenous populations that they're the ones, growing the cacao. They're the ones mining the minerals that we use in our smartphones. They're the ones doing all these things. And unfortunately, we live in a world that has capitalism as the main driving force, and capitalism always seeks to find the cheapest, most,
Most efficient. Yeah.
efficient and easy to source, and that really ultimately ends up in exploitation of indigenous peoples, is really what it ends up
Mm.
as. So we have to change that at a sort of systemic level, and I really believe that the way to do that is by creating companies and creating entities who are for profit, that the goal is to generate income so that we can use it for good things, but whose that the core principles and values of that company are not greed, that we don't really care about making a ton of money. That's not what we want. Me as the owner of this company, I'm not going to go home at the end of the day as a millionaire or a billionaire, but my impact in being able to effectuate all kinds of good and change will be much more dramatic, right? So if you can have that sort of harder to find these days values and core principles of
Mm.
I'm going to help create things that will pay for themselves, but also I'm not really my investment is not making a ton of money. My investment is making change
An
and impact.
impact.
And then even if
Yeah.
you do that, you can create a lot of different companies that are not, again, none of them are really meant to make a ton of money, but you can still make plenty of money by just owning a small, you know, equity in these companies that you can basically create that are going to be owned by indigenous communities, right? That's kind of
That's your
my
vision.
take on it.
Okay.
Right? That's what I'd like to do. I'd love to
Okay.
do that more actively. And so maybe Maya Bridge evolves into something more than just a language service provider, and that's a core thing that we do. But we also are going out and
Hmm.
helping indigenous communities thrive by helping them create sort of their own industries and companies that they own and they have ownership of, and we're just helping to sort of guide and providing, what help we can. That would be
Mm.
sort of my ideal vision. And then we
Okay.
can do all the things that those communities need, right? We can help increase education for those communities. We can help increase literacy using the revenue that we're generating from all these different industries that they're sort of running and operating and owning, that we're helping to distribute and to
Right.
connect all the dots to. Then we say, let's use, 20% of the profits we make from your industry, let's reinvest that into your education. Let's get these materials translated into your language. Let's do all these different things to
Right.
support.
And I'm hearing you kind of talking about really giving them agency, right?
Exactly.
And not being beholden to, a government or a charity or
Yep.
whatever, right?
And I
Let
think
them make the decisions about um, how they govern or how they shepherd their culture, right,
right.
going forward.
And
Hmm.
I think that just so many times throughout history, indigenous peoples have just been given the short end of the stick. I mean, like
Hmm.
intentionally oppressed and intentionally exploited and taken advantage of. And if you just
Yeah.
have somebody that is willing to go to bat for them and just say, "Hey, I'm going to be on your side. I'm going to fight for you. I'm going to advocate for you, and I'm going to do things out of a sort of altruistic, just wanting to help,"
Mm.
it can make a huge, huge difference.
Yeah, I have a friend who talks about moving his mindset from one of success to significance. right? And that difference being the 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 impact that you have on other people
Right,
versus what you're able to do for yourself, right? So
right.
beautiful sentiment. Um, yeah, and I'm curious. So if someone's listening and they want to learn more about Maya Bridge or how to access your services, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Yeah, so everyone that's interested in learning more can definitely check out our website. It's just www.mayabridge.org. And I think our LinkedIn is really where we're sort of the most active. We're always, providing different types of content. We post a lot of content about different languages. So it's interesting, even if you maybe don't need an interpreter for, some of these indigenous languages. It is fascinating to just go and see, wow, I had no idea that there were this many languages spoken in Guatemala or in Mexico. And we do some fun things like where we call it our word wise, where we teach. We have some of our linguists, our interpreters that will just record themselves saying a few different phrases in their language, and so then you can kind of just pick up maybe a few phrases, right, or just get just a little bit of familiarity. So yeah, that would be probably the best way to follow us on LinkedIn. Just look up Maya
Okay.
Bridge Services, following our website. And then on our website, if somebody does ever need access to interpretation services, and even if it's, maybe language access consultation, right? Because as an example, in Alaska, there's all these Native American languages that are still prevalent, and I'm sure that there's more that can be done to support indigenous language access in places like Alaska or wherever it may be. And we don't necessarily currently we don't really offer many of the Alaskan languages, but that's not because we can't do it. It's just because no one has come to us and said, "Hey, we need this. We need this."
Oh, so almost you're almost searching for applicability, right?
I
Or
would
maybe
love
there's other things that.
I would love for anybody who really is saying, "Hey, we have this need and we don't really know how to fix it." We can come in and we
Mhm.
can do that. Again, it's kind of the same issue of like I'm limited of what I can do unless somebody's willing to sort of pay for it. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
there's a limit to what I can do as far as being able to provide these services
right.
without somebody being willing to say, "Hey,
There's got to be a market.
yeah, there's got to be someone who's willing to come in and say, we need you to help us get this figured out." So anybody
Okay.
that's interested in talking with us, and again, I'm also willing to like speak. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about these issues, and I think it's important in a general sense for all of us to just be more aware of the fact that there are speakers of indigenous languages and even living here as your neighbors, right? Like you may not even realize that you live very close to a large community of indigenous language speakers. And again, it expands way beyond even just Latin American, right? We do now as a company, we do indigenous language services from all over the world. We do African indigenous languages, Micronesian languages, languages from India,
Oh,
indigenous languages from, Southeast Asia. So I think that it's just important for all of us to sort of gain a little bit higher understanding and awareness of the different people that are out there in the world, right? And understanding some of their challenges. So if anybody wants
awesome.
to talk more, I'm always happy to talk. And I can be reached on LinkedIn and through our website as well.
That's great. Well, you certainly expanded my worldview, my thinking and awareness on
Great.
indigenous languages right, here in our own backyard, right? Not even thinking about the numbers of people who are in the U.S. and are primarily speakers of indigenous languages. So it's been a pleasure today, Jace. Thank you, and
Thank you.
thanks for being a guest. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
All right,
thanks. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, John.
you bet.